Why does debt feel like a normal part of life in the United States, while in Germany it often carries a sense of caution, even discomfort, and in some cases, quiet avoidance, even when the numbers themselves may not look dramatically different on the surface? Imagine two individuals earning similar middle-class incomes, one living in a typical American city, the other in a mid-sized German town, both with access to modern banking systems, both participating in developed economies, both exposed to global consumer culture. Yet their relationship with debt evolves in fundamentally different ways, shaped not just by interest rates or policies, but by something deeper, something embedded in the systems around them and the psychological frameworks those systems quietly reinforce over time. In the United States, debt is not introduced as a last resort, but rather as an early and integrated financial tool, something that begins forming in young adulthood through student loans, credit cards, and auto financing, creating a baseline expectation that borrowing is not only acceptable, but often necessary to participate fully in economic life, which means the first interaction with money is rarely about accumulation, but instead about managing obligations, structuring repayments, and optimizing credit profiles, all of which gradually normalize the presence of debt as a background condition rather than an exception. This normalization is reinforced by the structure of the American financial system itself, where credit scores act as gatekeepers to opportunity, influencing access to housing, transportation, and even employment in some cases, which subtly shifts debt from being a liability into something closer to a credential, a measurable indicator of trustworthiness within the system, meaning that avoiding debt entirely can sometimes limit access rather than expand it, creating a paradox where responsible participation requires engagement with borrowing. In contrast, Germany operates on a different psychological and systemic foundation, where debt is less embedded in early financial life and more often associated with caution, long-term planning, and in some cases, hesitation, largely because the system does not rely as heavily on personal credit scores as a universal access mechanism, and because many essential aspects of life, such as education and healthcare, are structured in ways that reduce the immediate need for borrowing, which changes the baseline expectation from managing debt to avoiding it when possible. This difference becomes more visible when you look at how each system treats consumption over time, because in the United States, the availability of credit expands purchasing power into the present, allowing individuals to access goods and experiences before fully earning the corresponding income, which creates a forward-shifted lifestyle where current living standards are partially funded by future earnings, while in Germany, consumption tends to follow a more sequential pattern, where spending aligns more closely with accumulated resources, leading to a slower but more grounded financial rhythm. The math behind this divergence is not just about interest rates or repayment schedules, but about timing and compounding behavior, because when consumption is consistently pulled forward through credit, the cost of that convenience accumulates quietly in the background, not always in dramatic spikes, but through steady interest flows that extend over years, sometimes decades, shaping long-term financial flexibility in ways that are not immediately visible at the moment of purchase. At the same time, the American system offers certain advantages that make debt feel manageable, even strategic, particularly through fixed-rate loans, refinancing options, and a financial culture that emphasizes leveraging money to access opportunities earlier, whether that is through home ownership, education, or business creation, which means debt is not only normalized, but often framed as a tool for advancement, even though the outcomes depend heavily on timing, discipline, and broader economic conditions. Germany, on the other hand, tends to emphasize financial stability and predictability over rapid expansion, which is reflected in both policy and cultural behavior, where saving is often prioritized, borrowing is approached with more scrutiny, and long-term security is valued over immediate access, creating an environment where the absence of debt is not seen as a missed opportunity, but rather as a form of control, a way to maintain independence from financial obligations that could introduce uncertainty. This leads to a subtle but important psychological difference, because in the United States, individuals often build confidence in their ability to manage debt, to navigate repayment structures, and to balance multiple financial commitments simultaneously. While in Germany, confidence is more often built around stability, liquidity, and the ability to operate without relying heavily on borrowed money, which shapes not only financial decisions but also identity, influencing how people perceive risk, opportunity, and progress. When you zoom out to the systemic level, these patterns begin to reflect broader economic philosophies, where the American model leans toward growth driven by consumption and credit expansion, allowing the economy to accelerate through increased spending, while the German model leans toward stability and resilience, emphasizing controlled growth and reduced exposure to financial volatility, each approach carrying its own strengths and trade-offs depending on the context. Over time, these differences compound into distinct financial realities, where an American household might carry multiple forms of debt as a normal part of life, balancing mortgages, student loans, and credit lines, while a German household might prioritize minimizing liabilities, even if it means slower access to certain assets or experiences. And neither approach is inherently right or wrong, but each creates a different relationship with time, risk, and financial pressure. What makes this comparison particularly important is not the surface-level contrast, but the way systems shape behavior without requiring explicit decisions. Because most individuals do not consciously choose to adopt a debt-friendly or debt-averse mindset. They simply adapt to the structures around them, responding to incentives, constraints, and cultural signals that guide their choices in subtle but consistent ways. And once those patterns are established, they begin to reinforce themselves, as access to credit encourages more borrowing, while limited reliance on debt encourages more saving, creating feedback loops that extend beyond individual decisions and into generational habits, influencing how future decisions are made even before they are fully understood. In the end, the question is not whether debt is good or bad, but how different systems make it feel normal, acceptable, or risky, and how those feelings shape the decisions people make over time, often without realizing that what feels natural is not universal, but designed, structured, and quietly reinforced by the environment they live in, which means understanding these differences is less about comparing countries and more about recognizing the hidden frameworks that guide financial behavior in the first place.